Every photograph you have ever seen of Easter Island is, in a very real sense, incomplete. Those famous stone heads, the ones staring out across the Pacific with their long faces and heavy brows, the ones printed on postcards and textbook covers and just about every list of the world's great mysteries, aren't heads at all. They're full-length human figures, complete with torsos, arms, and carved hands resting on rounded bellies, standing in pits they themselves have slowly sunk into over centuries, buried up to the shoulders in their own accumulated sediment. For most of the people who have ever looked at a photograph of Easter Island, that fact alone would come as a genuine shock. But it isn't even the strangest part of the story, because when archaeologists finally got the legal permission to dig two of those statues out, what they found carved into the hidden stone underneath stunned even the people who had spent their entire careers studying them. Let's get the geography and the basic facts straight first, because this story only gets stranger the more precisely you understand what you're actually looking at. Easter Island, known to its indigenous Rapa Nui inhabitants simply as Rapa Nui, is one of the most remote inhabited places on the planet, a speck of volcanic rock in the South Pacific, roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest continental coastline. Polynesian voyagers reached it and settled it somewhere around the year 900, navigating open ocean for thousands of miles using nothing but stars, currents, and an extraordinary hard-won understanding of the sea. Over the following centuries, that small, isolated society carved nearly 1,000 monumental stone statues, known as moai, almost all of them quarried from the volcanic rock of a single crater called Rano Raraku. Some moai were dragged miles across the island to coastal platforms where they once stood facing inward, watching over their communities. Others, for reasons archaeologists are still piecing together, were simply left behind in the quarry itself, abandoned mid-production in various stages of completion, frozen exactly where the carving stopped. Here's where the popular image of Easter Island starts to mislead almost everyone who's ever seen it. The most widely circulated, most photographed moai on the entire island are a cluster standing on the outer slopes of Rano Raraku, the very quarry where they were born. And because of how those particular statues have weathered over the centuries, buried by sediment up to their necks, almost every iconic photograph you've ever seen of Easter Island shows nothing but heads poking up out of the grass. That image became so dominant in popular culture that it created one of the most persistent misconceptions in modern archaeology. Generations of people, looking at the exact same dozen or so photographs reproduced endlessly across books, postcards, and now the internet, simply assumed that's what the moai were. Heads. Nothing more. It helps to understand what these statues were actually for before getting into what was buried beneath them. The moai are widely understood to represent deified ancestors, carved likenesses meant to embody the living presence, or mana, of important figures from a clan's lineage. Almost all of them share a recognizable design, oversized heads accounting for roughly 3/8 of the entire statue's height. Deep, elongated eye sockets, prominent jaws, and elongated ears, with squat, legless bodies, and arms typically held close to the torso, hands resting near the waist. The statues erected on coastal stone platforms, called ahu, were positioned facing inland, watching over the communities responsible for them, almost like a permanent, stone-carved congregation of ancestors, keeping quiet vigil over their descendants. When European ships first reached the island in 1722, those coastal statues were reportedly still standing upright. By the latter half of the 1800s, every single one of them had been toppled, the result of internal conflict, earthquakes, and the broader collapse of the island's traditional social structures following sustained contact with the outside world, including devastating slave raids in the 1860s that decimated the population. Of the moai still complete and recognizable today, only a relatively small number, somewhere around 50, have ever been re-erected. The truth had actually been documented for a long time, just never widely publicized. As early as the 1910s, and again through expeditions in the 1950s, researchers visiting Rapa Nui had partially exposed sections of buried moai torsos and noted, in scientific reports almost nobody outside academia ever read, that the statues clearly continued below the surface. But those early digs were limited, often shallow, and in some cases reburied without full publication, leaving the broader question of what exactly lay beneath largely unresolved for decades. The scale of what had been attempted and accomplished by the original carvers only made the mystery more frustrating in the meantime. The largest moai ever successfully erected, a statue known as Paro, stood over 30 feet tall. Statues of that size, weighing many tons, were carved at Rano Raraku and then transported, by means still debated among researchers, sometimes for miles, across uneven terrain, to coastal platforms on the opposite side of the island, using nothing but wood, rope, and an extraordinary collectively organized human effort. Understanding how a society without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals pulled that off has been one of the central engineering puzzles of the entire site for over a century, And it's part of why getting a clear, undisturbed look at a Moai's full body, hidden details and all, mattered so much to researchers trying to reconstruct exactly how these things were built and handled in the first place. It took until 2010 for that question to get a serious, modern, systematic answer, when an archaeologist named Joanne Van Tilburg, director of the long-running Easter Island Statue Project, received the first legally permitted excavation of Moai at Rano Raraku since the 1950s. Working with the Rapa Nui community and Rapa Nui artist and co-director Christian Arevalo Pacarati, her team selected 2 adjacent statues on the quarry's inner slope, cataloged in their survey simply as Moai 156 and 157, and began the slow, careful work of digging them out, layer by stratified layer. What emerged from underneath the soil wasn't just confirmation that bodies existed, something researchers already broadly suspected. It was full torsos, complete with detailed carved arms folded across the stomach, hands with individually rendered fingers, and on the lower backs of both statues, something nobody had been able to see clearly in nearly a century. Carved designs, protected from 1,000 years of wind, rain, and erosion, specifically because the dirt that buried them had also accidentally preserved them. On the back of Moai 156, excavators found a dense, deliberate arrangement of petroglyphs, carvings cut directly into the statue's stone surface after it had already been positioned and partially buried. Among the imagery were 13 separate depictions of Polynesian voyaging canoes, along with a flying fish and a cluster of 3 lines arranged around a circle, a motif researchers have come to call the crescent design, found on only a small handful of Moai anywhere on the island. This wasn't random scratching. The canoes, in particular, carry enormous symbolic weight in Rapa Nui culture, since the island's entire origin story centers on a founding voyage, ancestors crossing thousands of miles of open Pacific to settle this single isolated speck of land. Finding that imagery carved onto the hidden back of a buried statue suggests this particular Moai wasn't simply a generic ancestor figure. It may have been specifically connected to the memory of that founding voyage, or erected at least in part to honor the navigators who made it. Out of the roughly 1,000 Moai cataloged across the island and in museum collections worldwide, only a tiny handful carry this kind of dense, deliberate petroglyph decoration on their bodies. The only comparably embellished statue researchers have identified is a Moai known as Hoa Hakananaya, removed from the island in 1868 and now held in the British Museum, which carries its own carved imagery linked to the island's later birdman ceremonial tradition, finding a second, similarly significant example. Still in place at Rano Raraku, never removed, never relocated, buried and protected by accident rather than design, gave researchers something the displaced Hoa Hakananaya never could: a chance to study the carving in its full original context, surrounded by the same soil, the same quarry walls, and the same archaeological layers that had shaped its history for centuries. Carbon dating and careful stratigraphic analysis of the layered soil deposits around the statues let Van Tilburg's team do something even more remarkable than just exposing the artwork. They could estimate roughly when, in the statue's long history, the ground had been stable enough and the petroglyphs accessible enough for someone to actually carve them. The evidence pointed to a window sometime after active quarrying in that specific section of Rano Raraku had already wound down, meaning these particular carvings weren't part of the statue's original creation at all. They were added later by people who returned to an already standing, partially buried Moai, specifically to add new meaning to it, treating it less like a finished static monument and more like a living surface, something a community kept coming back to. The deeper the team dug, the more the excavation started reshaping a much bigger question that had quietly nagged at Easter Island archaeology for years. For most of the 20th century, the dominant assumption about Rano Raraku was straightforward and fairly mechanical. It was treated essentially as an open-air factory, a workshop, a place where laborers cut, shaped, and abandoned statues, with nothing else of cultural or spiritual significance happening there beyond the quarrying itself. But as Van Tilburg's team kept excavating, kept sampling, kept mapping not just the statues, but the layers of soil surrounding them, the evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. Laboratory testing of soil samples recovered from deep within the quarry revealed unusually high concentrations of nutrients associated with cultivated food crops, specifically banana, taro, and sweet potato. That chemistry doesn't show up by accident in a barren industrial worksite. It shows up where people are actively gardening, generation after generation, enriching the soil deliberately, the same way farmers have done across human history wherever they've returned to cultivate the same patch of ground repeatedly. That single soil chemistry result quietly rewired how researchers understood the entire site. The testing was conducted in part by Sarah Sherwood, a professor of Earth and Environmental Systems, who joined the project after meeting a member of Van Tilburg's team at a geology conference, and who, out of scientific curiosity, rather than any specific expectation, ran fine-scale chemical analysis on soil samples brought back from the quarry. And what that analysis revealed surprised even the team that collected it. Rano wasn't just where Moai were born. According to Van Tilburg's published findings, it appears the Rapa Nui carvers and their community believed the statues themselves, and the act of carving them played a direct role in producing agricultural fertility, something the island desperately needed given its limited, often nutrient-poor volcanic soil and total isolation from any outside supply chain. The quarry wasn't simply an industrial zone where workers chipped away at rock and then went home. It looks increasingly like it was also a place of habitation, cultivation, and ongoing ceremony, where the statues, half buried and slowly emerging from the earth over the course of their working lives, were treated as active, living participants in the community's relationship with the land that fed them. The stratigraphic work behind all of this deserves a moment of its own credit, because it's easy to skip past how much painstaking labor goes into dating something this precisely without the benefit of written records. Researchers built what they describe as the first radiocarbon-informed Bayesian statistical model constructed for any site on Rapa Nui, layering carbon-dated organic material recovered from each distinct soil horizon around the statues, against the physical sequence in which those layers had been deposited. That combination let the team move beyond a vague sense that the carvings were probably old, and instead produce an actual estimated window for when the surrounding ground was stable enough, and the lower body exposed enough for someone to kneel down and start carving canoes into solid rock. It's slow, unglamorous, deeply technical work, the kind that rarely makes for a dramatic headline on its own, but it's exactly the kind of evidence that lets archaeologists say something is true with confidence, rather than simply guessing and hoping the guess holds up. Sit with that idea for a second, because it reframes something most people assume about these statues without ever questioning it. The popular image treats the Moai as finished objects, monuments completed once and then simply left in place forever, exactly the way a statue in a museum courtyard sits untouched for centuries. What the excavation evidence increasingly suggests is closer to the opposite. These were not static. People kept returning to them, kept carving new petroglyphs onto already buried surfaces, kept cultivating the ground around them, kept treating the slow accumulation of sediment around each. Statues based not as decay to be cleaned away, but as part of an ongoing living relationship between the carved ancestor figure and the soil that, quite literally, fed the people who had made it. Picture what that actually would have looked like on the ground, century after century. A Moai is carved lying on its back in the quarry, the way every statue here began before being raised upright. Over years, maybe decades, soil and volcanic sediment, washed down by rain and shifted by the slow creep of erosion, begins climbing up its legs, its torso, its shoulders. Rather than treating that burial as a problem to be solved, something to dig out and correct, the people living and farming around it appear to have worked with it, planting and tending crops in the increasingly fertile ground forming around the statue's base, occasionally returning to its exposed back to add new carvings, new meaning, new connections to ancestry and voyage and identity. The statue isn't disappearing into the earth from this perspective. It's settling into relationship with it, generation layered on generation, soil layered on soil, the same way a tree's rings record each year it's lived through. There's a reason this particular line of research moves so carefully and so slowly, and it's worth understanding before drawing too many sweeping conclusions. Excavating a Moai isn't like opening an old box in an attic. These are sacred objects to the living Rapa Nui community, ancestors made visible in stone, and the permits, consultation, and collaboration required to dig even two of them out took years to arrange properly, with Rapa Nui community members directly involved as partners in the work rather than as bystanders to someone else's project. That's part of why a discovery this significant took until 2010 to even formally begin, more than half a century after the previous serious excavation attempt, and why the resulting publications have been careful, incremental, and deliberately cautious about how far the evidence can be pushed. Real archaeology, done properly and respectfully, rarely moves at the pace people online wish it would. What makes this discovery land so hard isn't some manufactured mystery bolted onto the story afterward. It's the simple fact that millions of people, for generations, looked directly at photographs of something profoundly more complete and more meaningful than what they assumed they were seeing, and nobody noticed. Because the most famous, most reproduced images happened to show only the parts sticking out of the ground. The real bodies, the real carvings, the real evidence of an ongoing living relationship between a community and the land it depended on, were there all along, just a few feet beneath where every tourist photograph happened to stop. It also reframes something else worth sitting with. Easter Island has spent decades buried under a very different kind of mythology, one involving ancient aliens, lost continents, and explanations that skip straight past the actual people who built this place, as if a society this isolated couldn't possibly have organized the labor, the engineering, and the cultural sophistication to carve, move, and continually reinterpret nearly 1,000 multi-ton statues entirely on their own. That kind of speculation tends to thrive precisely in the gaps left by incomplete evidence. And for most of the 20th century, the question of what lay beneath these statues was exactly that kind of gap. Photographed constantly, explained rarely, and filled in the meantime with whatever story happened to be most entertaining. The real excavation evidence argues for something almost more impressive than any of that speculation. A society of a few thousand people settled on one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth, built and maintained an evolving relationship with their land, their ancestors, and their food supply that was sophisticated enough to leave a chemical fingerprint in the soil and an artistic fingerprint on stone surfaces hidden for centuries, using nothing but their own hands, their own tools, and an understanding of their environment passed down across generations. No outside help required, no lost technology necessary, just patient, accumulated intergenerational human ingenuity applied to one of the most unforgiving environments people have ever successfully settled. The statues are still being studied. The Easter Island Statue Project has, over decades, documented well over 1,000 individual moai and related stone objects across the island and in museum collections worldwide. And the inner slopes of Rano Raraku alone still hold a number of partially buried figures that have never been fully excavated. Researchers studying burial sites near several statues have also found concentrations of red pigment in the surrounding soil, suggesting some moai may have been ceremonially painted red during specific rituals, with human burials sometimes clustered near a particular statue, hinting that families may have buried their own dead close to the carved ancestor figure most closely associated with their lineage. Every one of these threads, the petroglyphs, the soil chemistry, the pigment, the burials, points toward the same broader conclusion. These statues were never simply finished and forgotten. They were active participants in an ongoing, evolving relationship between the living and the dead, one that modern excavation is only now slowly piecing back together. And every one of the still buried moai is, in theory, carrying its own version of that same hidden information, carvings, chemistry, evidence of ritual, simply waiting under a few feet of sediment for someone with the right permits, the right partnerships, and the right patience to carefully bring it back into the light. If stories like this are the kind that actually keep you watching, the real ones, where careful patient science turns out to be more astonishing than any invented mystery, hit subscribe so the next one finds you, and send this to someone who still thinks those statues were just heads.